Special thanks to Avtar Singh Bhasin, the author of the book that we are going to discuss, as also thanks to Dr. Tanvi Madan and to Anand Krishnan, who are the two uh, people who will discuss the book. Uh, I'll keep my remarks fairly brief. Bhasin Saab's book is something that I've seen um, over the last 3 years or so in many iterations, many incarnations. But obviously, the finished product is hugely different from all the things that we had discussed. It's an important book. I think there is some open microphone somewhere. Can we close that? Um, the book is important. That's self-evident from the attention it has commanded. And I would just say, in essence, it offers three turn points at which the relationship between India and China could have taken a different turn. The first turn point came around 1950-51, when there was a major debate between the Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, and Sardar Patel, Girija Shankar Bajpai, and others, on whether or not the fact of major differences on the alignment of the border should be discussed and taken up with China now or later. And Panditji opted for later. The second major turn point came at the time of the first meetings that India carried out with China on Tibet. The draft note that prepared the path to the debate is available. It's part of the Bhasin collection of documents, the 5-volume collection of India-China documents. And as the negotiations ended after some 3.5 months or so in Beijing, Panditji decided to alter the maps of India. That maps which had shown the boundary as undefined were overnight replaced with maps that showed the boundary as set and firm. And that was a major turning point. It was a unilateral action. And the third turning point, in my eyes, as evident from the book, came in 59-60. On the 9th of September, Chou Enlai had a long meeting with Ambassador G. Parthasarathy, GP as he was called, and suggested a 3-point formula. And then he pushed for face-to-face negotiations. Panditji agreed somewhat reluctantly. And the story of Chou Enlai's visit to India in April 1960 is a major piece in Bhasin Saab's book. So these are the 3 turn points as I see them, and I won't say more about it. We have 2 outstanding speakers who will discuss the book after Bhasin Saab, and that is Dr. Tanvi Madan and Anand Krishnan. A couple of simple ground rules, please. First, all questions will be taken only through the chat window. It makes for more efficient handling of a discussion in which there are over 70 people present right now. Second, the first 4 questions will be asked by scholars who are under 35. Now, this is a self-declared 35. There is nobody who is going to ask for a birth certificate or an Aadhaar card. But if you are under 35, please preface your question with the words U-35. That will help Shruti to identify the person in the order of priority, and the first 4 questions will be from those who are under 35. So please come forward. We want this event to be particularly an event for young researchers, scholars, and people interested in international affairs. because people of my ripe old age and others of great wisdom apparently tend to dominate these discussions, and I think we should find space for young scholars. I've said enough. Bhasin Saab, the floor is yours. You have, as we have negotiated, 17 minutes for your initial presentation. You'll be followed by Dr. Tanvi Madan and Anand Krishnan, who will each speak for 10 minutes. We may have a little conversation among the four of us, if time permits. Otherwise, we'll go straight to the floor. Thank you very much, Bhasin Saab. Bhasin Saab, you have the floor. You have to unmute, sir. Unmute, please. Yes, sir. You can speak now.
Well, thank you, sir. And without going into the formalities, I start with my presentation. The trigger for this book came from an earlier 5-volume publication of documents on India-China relations. In studying these documents, I found the story emerging was substantially at variance with what we knew so far about the unfortunate events leading to the unfortunate war in 1962. I realized if we continue to live with the same old story, there will never be a solution to this intractable problem, and which has defied a solution to this solution then and since. I decided to put the facts in a cogent manner before the public and then leave it to them to take a call. Coming to the book, studying the mindset of the Indian and Chinese leaders as they took charge of their countries gave some clue to the problems. The objectives they had set for themselves were asymmetrical. However, they had one fact in common. They were undisputed leaders of their parties during the struggles and later of their countries. Nehru's mindset was conditioned by his desire to lead the countries of Asia and Africa after India gets independence. In August 1946, he had said India is going to be the center of a very big federation, which would include China, Southeast Asia, and also West Asia. About a month later, on 15 September, he again emphasized there has been a tendency for many of the dependent countries in Asia and Africa to look towards India for leadership in their attempt to attain political economic freedom. There were several similar statements from Nehru which gave indication of his ambition to leadership. It was this mindset that was apparent in his speech in Parliament on 12th June 1952. He had said, and I quote, "I beg this House not to consider our foreign policy in terms of merely of our own petty success or failure, because the success or failure of any foreign policy today involves the success or failure of the whole world." Chinese leader Mao Zedong had, on the other hand, without claiming any leadership role, did not feel shy of proclaiming that China shall emerge in the world as a nation with an advanced culture and one with power. There was no desire to lead the world, but to become a great power on its own right and wipe away the century of humiliation that China was exploited by the foreign imperialism. Mao emphasized the era when China could be insulted or humiliated when the people were regarded as uncivilized was now over. India's experience in achieving freedom and China's seizing power were different. China seized power by waging a civil war, while India had evolved from colonialism to independence by act of British Parliament through transfer of power. As such, the experiences of the struggling years had a great impact on their future strategy in facing each other and their domestic and non-domestic issues. The Chinese leaders with their PLA intact were marshals and generals, and use of army came to them naturally. As Commander-in-Chief of the PLA, Zhu Dei, in a speech on 24 September 49, declared that the common program demanded the waging of the revolutionary war to the very end and the liberation of all the territories of China, including Formosa, Hainan Island, and Tibet. Ambassador Panikar, in his resume of the first 6 months of communist rule, had said there was no adventurism in Mao's policies. Tibet, however, had claimed vast areas in India like Darjeeling, Sikkim, Bhutan, Ladakh, and many more. As he said, these were Tibetan territories which the British in the past had gradually integrated in India. India, however, ignored Tibetan claims. The Prime Minister later said, if India had accepted Tibetan claims, India's border would have come down to the Ganga. Somehow, Prime Minister Nehru remained in awe of the Chinese communists. In June 1949, he said, the Chinese Revolution was one of the biggest changes and upheavals in history and was going to have far-reaching consequences. He too had some apprehensions about China's friendship, but remained smug and cautious as not to antagonize it. He had cautioned his officers that nothing was done to foster the Chinese accusations that India was acting as an instrument of USA and UK in Tibet. Yet China had no qualms branding Nehru the lackey of the British and increased and demarcus. Later, as the tension on the borders increased, Nehru did not agree to replace the Sikkimese police with Indian police personnel on the checkpost in Sikkim-Tibet border, since he feared it would create new situation which will be very troublesome to us. In the process, he made many compromises in the hope China would be propitiated and would cooperate in his endeavor to work for Asian solidarity and for world peace generally. India had no such illusion. India's support for Tibetan autonomy was suspected by it of having hidden agenda of preserving its own privileges in Tibet and warned India bluntly, not once but many times, that Tibet was its internal affair and it would not tolerate any interference. There were moments when China's behavior was outright insulting, as it called Nehru's resolution in the UN General Assembly on the repatriation of Korean War as the parent of all evils, and even disputed Indian claim to its friendship. Or the disparaging remarks on the conduct of India's first general election in 1952, or later when India was held responsible for the revolt in Tibet. He did take them seriously, but felt helpless to challenge China, and sometimes did not take them even seriously and accused in whatever China said and did for making illusion of Chinese friendship among the people of India. The three-segmented India-China frontier had many infirmities and had never been delineated or demarcated scientifically after surveys and discussions. Even when Henry McMahon, who in 1914 had Simla set up India-Tibet border and given it its name, had sat in London when delivering a lecture on international borders at the Royal Society for the Encouragement of Art in October 1935. And what he said, for want of accurate local knowledge and absence of detailed surveys, it rendered it impossible to define large portions of it except in somewhat general terms. Significantly, though the McMahon line had placed Tuang in India, which India later called Northeast Frontier, it was never occupied either by the British or independent India and remained in Tibetan occupation until 1951, when India sent a military detachment and occupied it under Tibetan protest, notwithstanding the fact that the British in 1944 and India in July 1948 assured Tibet that McMahon line would be amended in Tibet in favor of Tibet and to restore Tuang back to Tibet. Indian occupation was now to preempt Tuang falling into Chinese hands, since it was evident that with Tibet integrated in China, Tuang restored to Tibet would bring down China's borders to the plains of Assam creating a security dilemma. In the face of these developments, the Prime Minister had declared that maximum line was our border, map or no map, and we shall not let anybody cross it. If the situation on eastern frontiers was not congenial, it was far from agreeable on the western frontier. Here, Ladakh's frontier ran along the Axis was undefined in the southern India maps that India inherited from the British, and it remained undefined later when the maps were reprinted in the subsequent years. India consciously decided to avoid discussion of the frontier during the talks on Tibet Agreement in 1954. Though India was aware that Axis was a disputed area and needed discussion. The Ministry of External Affairs, before the discussion had taken place, took note of the Chinese Common Program, which had declared that the special rights which arose from unequal treaties were no longer in existence. And it had warned that the Chinese government would examine all treaties between Kuomintang and the foreign governments and shall recognize, abrogate, revise, or renegotiate them according to respective contents. It was perhaps this reason that India avoided discussion on borders in 1954. The Prime Minister presumed that by not discussing the frontiers, they stood settled and articulated it several times later, but it convinced nobody. 2 months after Tibet Agreement, also known as the Panchil Agreement, had been signed, Nehru issued instruction to the Ministry of External Affairs that the old maps with undefined borders were withdrawn and fresh maps were issued showing the frontier with a definite line, and that would henceforth be India's firm border, not open to discussion with anyone. This was an international border and needed discussion with the other stakeholders was ignored. It must be pointed out that Nehru, in issuing these instructions, had neither consulted the cabinet, nor any one of his colleagues, nor taken advice from many experts. That made the frontier controversial. Prime Minister, taking a simplistic view, made both the eastern and western borders sacrosanct and non-negotiable. The importance of agreed, well-defined, delineated, demarcated border was ignored. As you all know, lines on the maps separate the geographical and political jurisdictions of countries lying on either side of those lines. They reflect the vagaries and irrationalities of history. Well-defined and mutually agreed borders come into being as a result of adjustment of rival claims, interests, and ambitions of the stakeholders at the points where they are joined. But Nehru, at the very beginning in November 1951, declared in Parliament that maps or no maps, India's borders were what they were and non-negotiable, and yet continued to have doubts about their acceptance by China. As he said, our frontier lines by itself may be challenged as it has been challenged by the previous Chinese governments. Later, expressing his hesitation in discussing the frontiers, he had said, since we were sure of our borders, the question was why invite discussion about a thing on which we had no doubt. It remains a mystery how the Prime Minister claimed that India had no doubts about India's border, as he himself had been casting doubts. He knew the Ladakh border was disputed in Government of India's own regard, and he was not unaware about China's non-acceptance of the election. His dichotomous thinking did not see them as doubts. Let us look at what he said in the Rajya Sabha on 8 December 1959. He, repeating the old line, said that since we were sure of our borders, the question was why invite discussion about a thing on which we had no doubt. But now he qualified it to admit that with the advantage of hindsight, he considered that it was not a very wise policy and that a lingering doubt.
2 minutes, please.
Okay, sir. Lingering doubt remained in my mind and in my mystic mind as to what might happen in the future. But still it was felt, and this is very important. We should hold our own with the lapse of time and events would confirm it. And by the time challenge comes, we would be in a much stronger position to face it. Justifying this untenable position, he claimed that it is not as if it was not thought out. After the longest and clearest thinking and consultation with those who were concerned between our ambassadors and Foreign Affairs Committee and others, we came to this. One can only say it was hypocrisy at best. Let us look at another statement made by Foreign Secretary Sri Maldas a couple of months before the above statement of the Prime Minister. Addressing the annual conference, the governors of the Indian states in October, also in 1959, he said, Sikkim-Tibet boundary, delimited in 1896, was the only boundary along the entire frontier which was properly delimited. That the border needed to be discussed with an open mind and with other stakeholders was without doubt a necessity. There was an opportunity in April 1960 when Zhu and Lai had come to India for discussion on the borders. It was not utilized for a settlement. On the contrary, the Prime Minister took a line which was not conducive to any friendly settlement, and the result, as we know, was 1962. Before I end, I would like to quote the well-known historian Ordinal Toynbee, who had said, historical changes are driven by challenge and response, and civilizations are defined not just by the leadership or condition, but how they respond to difficult problems and crises. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Bhasin Saab. Both your book and your comments provide rich material for reflection, and I will not presume to either summarize or comment on any of this. We will go straight to the next speaker, and that is Dr. Tanvi Madan. Tanvi, you have, if you permit, 10 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to Ambassador Rana and to Ambassador Kantha as well. And also to Mr. Bhasin for this kind of wonderful book. It's a real pleasure to be invited to discuss it. And it's always nice to be on a panel with Anant Krishnan. I always learn from Anant as well. And if you haven't read his book, it's very worthwhile to read it as well. I do want to start with expressing gratitude also, not just for this book that Mr. Bhasin has done, but for all the work he's put in over the years to collate, gather, painstakingly put together these collections of documents, and now this book that has made life much easier and the work of scholars like me much better, I would say, because we have had access to that work. So I do want to say thank you to that. One of the things as I was reading this book is thinking about, and I came at this from both a historian by training, but also somebody who does kind of more policy relevant research these days. And so as I was thinking about it, thinking about how much we think about how this book resonates with the contemporary situation, but also if it resonates across borders. These are not just issues that are relevant for India and China, and not just in terms of thinking about borders, but that is a crucial aspect. So I want you to step back and think about a leader who believes their country needs to focus on economic growth and development and believes that China wants to do the same. A leader who indeed admires what China has achieved. A leader who thinks engagement with China can benefit their country, but also deter China from taking aggressive actions. A leader who thinks this engagement should include developing economic ties and working with China on global issues. A leader who believes that personal diplomacy and high-level summits and understandings can change Chinese behavior and convince Beijing to focus on cooperation rather than competition. A leader who believes that agreements that he or she reaches with China will hold. And a leader who thinks China might be a challenge, but all these things that that leader does to engage China will buy their country time to tackle that challenge down the line. Am I talking about India's first prime minister or its current prime minister in his initial years in office? Or am I talking about any one of the number of American presidents over a 40-year period? Or even any given European leader today? The reason I outline these questions is that there's often this issue of the relevance of history and books like the ones Mr. Bhasin has written for the contemporary situation. Even if there are a lot of differences from the past, you can see that at the very least, there is resonance. And Mr. Bhasin in his book alludes to those who ignore history are condemned to repeat it idiom that we know. As this book shows, history is important and useful for a number of reasons. One, as an antecedent, it tells us what came before and why we are at the situation we are today. And you see this, I don't think you can understand, for example, what is going on in the China-India boundary situation if you don't understand what the kind of developments that Mr. Bhasin outlines in his book. History is also useful as a guide. It can offer lessons of what to do and equally importantly, what not to do. History is also important as bias. If you want to understand, for example, why Indian governments have tended to be cautious about publicly discussing their boundary negotiations, you have to go back to 1955. And as Mr. Bhasin outlines, Nehru's decision to take the dispute public. And so while we talk about 1960, one question would have been, once that decision to take it public, which from the perspective of being a democracy, you can understand, but once that dispute was taken public, could Prime Minister Nehru have even made the kind of concessions that would have been required in 1960 during Zhou Enlai's visit? History is finally also important as baggage. And Mr. Bhasin outlines this in his epilogue, outlines how this history, this historical baggage continues to shape today what's possible and what is not just in India, but in China as well. And for each of these kind of utilities of history for the contemporary situation, I would say Mr. Bhasin's book is worth reading, not only if you're interested in the history, but also in what is possible and what is not today, and the history that any policymaker will have to grapple with as they try to manage the dispute, potentially down the line, maybe even resolve it. This history will be important. And it is important, I would say, both on its own, but if you can get access to it, ideally if you can purchase it, also in conjunction with Mr. Bhasin's 5-volume collection of documents on India-China relations, which really do kind of give you that next level of detail that from the book itself that Mr. Bhasin has currently. The book itself outlines the origins and developments related to many of the issues and questions we continue to discuss this day to do with China-India relations, and particularly the boundary dispute. It does cover the decision-making around the 1962 war, but I think importantly, the value add of the book is that it particularly spends most of the time tracing the path to that point. It considers the debates, the internal debates within the government, some of the roads not taken. And it does so not just in terms of Delhi's debate, but also that in the Tibetan leadership. And one additional value add of this book is that it doesn't just look at India, China, it brings kind of Tibet back into these stories. And they had independent motivations, independent agency, and even differences within various parts of the Tibetan leadership that I think you get a sense of both in the book and the 5-volume collection. I think another strength of the book is it goes back to even before independence and telling us a story through official correspondence, which is the real kind of strength of this book. Kind of almost like blow by blow, you feel that you are in these discussions. That pre-1947 history is quite interesting because in some ways it shows how kind of the debate that the British were having in many ways reflected that the debates that newly independent India continued to have. And frankly, we even have to this day. The British officials grappling with, debates like kind of where they were sitting. If you were sitting in London and you had an interest in developing a relationship with China, including economic ties with China, as they do today, then you want to take a different position on the boundary. You don't want to actually rake up issues that might be a problem. That pre-1947 history is also important, Mr. Bhasin argues, because it does kind of lay out how, it does talk about how India's subsequent approach derived from some of those British positions, but also those British positions became a cage of sorts, where there was a sense of not moving, not reassessing whether those were the right assumptions and actions and approaches to take. I will also say the book has a strength of showing how the views within governments weren't monolithic. There were differences within government. Sometimes, as I said, it depended on where you sit. The British political officer sitting in Lhasa and the British colonial government in Delhi and the British government in London had different stances from their vantage point. Sometimes you have the same people having contradictory approaches. Mr. Bhasin talks about Prime Minister Nehru, but you see this even in the bureaucrats or the diplomats involved. KPS Menon, for example, Ambassador Menon in 1949, for example, wanted a more forward-leaning position on Tibet. But this would have required something he later opposed, which was tilting towards the West. Ambassador Bajpai, Gurjar Shankar Bajpai, warning against too much aid to Tibet in 1949, considering saying that it would provoke the communists. But later, as we know, along with Sardar Patel, took a very different stance and wanted to be more forward-leaning. I'm just going to take a couple of my remaining minutes that I think I have to also talk about some things that will spark debate and perhaps be a little bit more controversial. One is that on the boundary question, Mr. Bhasin is not shy about questioning the mainstream view that China was the country that was difficult and perfidious, as he puts it. He outlines, as historian Srinath Raghavan did, that Nehru's considering or behaving like the boundary issue was settled, and for a few years instructing officials not to raise it when it was clear that China had not accepted. He took silence in some ways as acquiescence when it wasn't that. Mr. Bhasin's book also outlines the mistakes that were made, and it is important that we learn from these mistakes. It's also important we understand history to learn from successes. But in terms of the mistakes, you see kind of the mistakes of understanding why decisions were made. Could mistakes have been fixed? Could they be repeated? And what should be done to ensure that they are not? And I think this is where I would say that, some of the mistakes Mr. Bhasin outlines in the book, you see in terms of some of the ones we mentioned on Nehru already, but you see Nehru, for example, underestimating communist ideology and how it shaped Chinese decision-making. You also saw him underestimating, and not just him, but other officials as well, and American officials not covered in the book, but it was true, the Chinese propensity or the intention to use force. Sometimes, however, and I will kind of end on this, is that documents can often differ, can throw up different interpretations and lessons. And I'll mention one instance where my research into the documents offers a different view than Mr. Bhasin's. Not that Nehru didn't make mistakes, and even the mistakes that were made by other parts of government, at the end of the day, the buck stops with the prime minister. But the mistakes in terms of what were the mistakes I think that Nehru made, and what shaped Prime Minister Nehru's perceptions of China and the resultant kind of errors from that. Mr. Bhasin notes that the prime minister was emotional about China and saw through the prism of Asian solidarity, and that caused many of the mistakes. I don't disagree that Nehru made mistakes, as I said, but I'd argue that the prism that Nehru saw China through was a post-colonial one, and he saw India's options to deal with China from that prism as well as the constraints he had and India had in terms of taking certain approaches and actions. I'll mention again, I know I'm over time, so I'll very quickly say the mistakes I would argue that Nehru made was that he saw different priorities and didn't want to make the trade-offs that would be required. One was he was very focused on nation building. So peace wasn't for peace's sake. He thought that he could not afford to go to war, whether it was Tibet or anything else, because India needed to focus on building a new independent India. And he thought, mirror imaging, another mistake, that China would have the same calculation. Second, budget. He had constrained resources. He would have had to figure out how much he could spend on development and defense. Third, Pakistan. The Pakistan front was live. Where do you make the trade-off on whether you fight China or you fight Pakistan? And finally, this was a prime minister, but also other leadership who wanted independence from other powers, strategic autonomy, as we call it today, something you had leadership across the board outline. And I will end with saying one of the questions that arises is, would we have seen India that would have gone in the direction, after all, the famous Patel note on China also calls for a different relationship with the great powers. So would the country have been more accepting of even an alliance with the US to be able to take on China? And the reason I raise these questions is we are still grappling with this today, trade-offs that have to be made if we are going to think about taking China as a challenge seriously.
Thank you, Tanvi. You have indeed slightly overstepped the time, but you were in full flow, and I didn't have the heart to stop you. Anant, you, sir, have the floor. I'm not giving any introductions, etc., for the sake of saving time, but these are all people of great achievement, great scholarship, and great learning. You know that. I don't have to repeat it. Anant, please.
Thank you, Ambassador Rana. Thank you also to Ambassador Kanta and ICS. And thanks, Tanvi, for your remarks. And I think your really comprehensive and perceptive assessment of the book, which has kind of rendered what I had to say obsolete. But since I'm here, I'll share what I wanted to say for what it's worth. First of all, I just wanted to say it's a pleasure and honor to be involved with this event. This is the first time I've actually had the pleasure of interacting directly with Mr. Bhasin, and he's probably unaware of how much impact he has had on me in terms of my own job of reporting on China and studying India's relations with China. I'm not exaggerating to say that I count his 5-volume documentary study as among my most treasured possessions. And for those who haven't read those 5 volumes, it is an extraordinary resource. And I'd say, Tanvi might disagree, but I'd say unusually for a collection of documents, it really reads like a thrilling page turner that captures the twists and turns of the relationship, which is a testament to Mr. Bhasin's research. And it's something I keep going back to, as I did last year as well, when reporting on the LAC crisis and going back to the negotiations of 1960, the officials report, which makes sense of Galwan Valley and so many other places that we read about in the news. So it's a fantastic resource. And I think while he's already done us this enormous service with that compilation, this book goes a step further by distilling some of the most important takeaways. And I thought that I would share the perspective of a journalist who reports on this relationship and share 5 observations that I had that I think make this book really relevant to us who are following developments today. At the outset, I wholeheartedly agree with Mr. Bhasin's conclusion that I think unlearning and relearning this history is crucial to untying many of the knots that we are still dealing with. And I think that starts with more critically examining India's own role in some of these events. The first point that I wanted to share is regarding India's relations with pre-PRC China, that is the engagement in the 1930s and early 1940s, which is a period that doesn't get all that much attention, particularly the 1947 to 1949 period when New India was engaging with what was still KMT China is a bit of a blind spot for many of us. And I think that the book does underline how many current Chinese views of India and even CPC views of India, CPC views of Tibet and on the boundary go back a long way. And in many ways are deeply ingrained pre-1949 and things that were shared by the KMT as well. He quotes KM Panikkar noting the KMT attitude was generally friendly, but a little patronizing, which I think sums up pretty well. In 1947, you had the then Chinese KMT vice foreign minister say that they wanted to amend unequal treaties and they rejected the Simla Convention. So it isn't to say really that India should have been completely unprepared or taken aback by what the communists did. And I thought it was very interesting that he highlighted those early years, which I think merit deeper research. Secondly, on Tibet, the book reminds us of the many missed opportunities, of course, that India had perhaps to have handled it differently. There's lots of enriching documentary evidence from the warnings from the political officer, Hareshwar Dayal, how Delhi responded to those warnings. And I think the accounts leave us in no doubt that the significance of developments in Tibet were consistently perhaps underplayed. Maybe it was a sense of denial, but the fact is it wasn't taken as seriously as it should have. But I would perhaps add one footnote here, which is, however critical we may be in the lessons we glean from the correspondence that Mr. Bhasin brings out, should perhaps be tempered by the reality that, quite frankly, India did not really have realistic military options that might have drastically altered the course of events in Tibet, even if all those decades further on, we like to think we could have. What also does really come through for me in this account, which brings me to my third observation, is the contradictions of the man who's very much at the center of this book, who is Prime Minister Nehru. Contradictions both in terms of his views towards Tibet and more broadly how he looked at China as well. And I think the credit to Mr. Bhasin is he brings this out drawing on nothing else but Pandit Nehru's own words and his own writing. And as he puts it, his hallucinations were unfathomable, which is how Mr. Bhasin puts it. On the one hand, he was impressed with China's greatness, but on the other, he was distrustful as well of its long-term intentions towards India and Tibet. On the one hand, he was in some ways reconciled to what was happening with the PLA's occupation of Tibet. But then on the other, he wanted to try and shape negotiations and ensure that China's takeover was peaceful. And at the same time, despite all of this, he saw in China's revolution the rise of Asia. It's something parallel to India's own experience. And I think that it's important for us to note that if Nehru was willing to share this Pan-Asian sentiment and glory, it's pretty clear that the Chinese didn't really reciprocate, despite what they may have said. And I think that one thing we should take away from this portrait of Nehru, I would argue, is a far more nuanced portrait of Nehru and his dealings with China, a critical portrait, but far more nuanced than I think the caricature that exists today of somebody who was soft on China and then betrayed. I think if you look at his stand on the negotiations, it was hardly soft, it was the other extreme. I think this notion of betrayal as well that has been ingrained in our consciousness, I think Mr. Bhasin has made a compelling case for us to permanently retire it from our vocabulary. I think because of the fact that it makes very little sense in understanding the events of the late 50s and early 60s, even though I think we've clung on to betrayal as a crutch, even reporting on boundary events last year. Betrayal was perhaps the tagline you would see. Betrayal and perfidy would be the taglines you would see the media using. But is it really a lens that makes sense? I think his book leads us to question that. On the boundary issue, I think Mr. Bhasin is absolutely right in asking us to revisit the events that led to 62. I think the pivotal point, I think Ambassador Rana also mentioned the 1960 visit from Zhou Enlai and the negotiations, very, very detailed negotiations that, of course, the 5 volumes present as well. And I think it really should be essential reading for anyone. I think the book says very rightly that in any negotiation, you need 2 parties to make sacrifices. You can't have one party coming into the process saying that there was nothing to negotiate. And I think it is an uncomfortable fact that China perhaps showed willingness to accommodate India more than the other way around. And part of it is also tied to how our borders in the Western sector came into being, which is something that another matter that perhaps there should be more public awareness of. Since we tend to report on borders as being permanent and sacrosanct and being in place for centuries, but that was hardly the case. But I do want to add a point here that while I do share the sentiment, there needs to be a more informed public debate on the boundary, on the settlement. What are the costs of settling? What are the costs of not settling? There is, of course, something to be said of the other side that is party to this dispute and what we are discussing today. I mean, China's motivations are not the focus of this book. It's about Nehru, Tibet, and China. But at the same time, I think it's important to keep in mind Beijing's own domestic motivations and drivers, which perhaps should receive more attention. Even in assessing relations today, we tend to sometimes examine our actions as if they are in a vacuum. Just as an example, in 1962, you had in the summer of 62, you had the domestic turmoil from the Great Leap Forward. You had Mao dealing with the fallout of that and perhaps worried about his own position. And it seems to be an increasingly growing argument in a lot of scholarship that there were Mao's own sort of domestic political considerations in going to war, but not just necessarily responding to the forward policy or what Nehru was doing. And even with the boundary question, even if India comes to terms, as Mr. Bhasin rightly advocates, with the origins of the borders, of the origins of the Western borders and the maps of 54, I would still say the biggest obstacle to me is not Indian public opinion, but maybe how China looks at the boundary question, which is as leverage to be used. And I think that partly explains their demands for a major concession, the current demands for a major concession in the East, because they know that they're making a demand that can never be met. So I think that's a reflection of the fact that unless their broader strategic misgivings regarding India changes, the rest perhaps might not make much of a difference. A final point, and I'll conclude, I have my eye on the clock, I think is a point on the importance of transparency, something that Tanvi alluded to in a democracy, and lessons for us to remember today. Mr. Bhasin's book time and again writes that a lot of these problems stemmed from Nehru wanting to keep things under wraps, which, as Tanvi says, is also understandable to some degree. But this resulted in an uninformed public, which was pretty much falling prey to what was said in the official media. So how much has changed since in how we report on developments on the border or on national security? I would say not very much. Mr. Bhasin argues quite bravely that conceiving a solution requires convincing the public that the position taken by India in the past was not a rational one, as he puts it. And he says it would be necessary to open the MEA archives in entirety, which I don't think anyone would disagree with. But I think his account is also a warning of having a foreign policy, government institutions, everything in foreign policy decision-making rely around one leader, and the idea that if you have somebody with strong personality and charisma, that's enough to influence the other side, which of course ended up being I think a very costly assumption in the 1950s. And I think something that we should perhaps reflect on today as well. And I think I will end there, Bazarana.
Thank you very much, Anand. Bhasin Saab, you'd be pleased to know that we don't have a single question. This means that either you have given such complete satisfaction to the 70 people who have graciously joined this event, or that you have bold bouncers which have gone so high over everybody's head that nobody knows what to ask you. I mean, really, I am perplexed. This is probably the first event with which I'm involved where, now there are two questions. There are two questions. Somebody who is under 39, okay, 39 is almost as good as 35. So I will take this question. It's a question for Anand. What could have been the compulsion for Nehru to recognize the occupation of Tibet by China? The question is intended for Anand, but I'm tempted to say that was there an alternative? But anyway, Anand, the question is for you to tackle, please. And maybe Bhasin Saab might also like to comment on that.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think this is for Mr. Bhasin because he talks about this in his book quite a bit. And since you have the author here, I think that this is for him to weigh in on, and I think he really explains this in the book. But I would agree with partly with what Ambassador Rana said, which is A, what was the alternative, and B, I think as the book brings out as well, perhaps there was a sense of hope and optimism that he could influence things in a way which didn't really pan out, and I think that a misreading as well in terms of. Especially with the visit of the Dalai Lama in 1956, which Mr. Bhasin talks about, and I think, which you said, ended up as a source of regret as well, that they believed Chinese assumptions that ended up being completely different. But I would defer this question, and I would pass it on to the author himself.
Bhasin Saab, please come in.
Sir, there, as you rightly said at the beginning, there was no alternative. Nehru was pleading again and again only for autonomy. But they said nothing doing. And China was determined to take it up. Even Mao had said, Tibet's problem is small, but very important. It butted on the northwestern frontier of China, Xinjiang, the various provinces. It was accessible. They were afraid that if any foreign power occupied Tibet, the whole of China's southern borders will be open for aggression or occupation. So for China, it has become most important issue. As they said, we have to have these countries back into our fold, and there's no question of accept. We were told you have no business to interfere in our internal affair. What was the alternative before us? We couldn't go to war. Neither were prepared to go to war, nor there was enough potential to go to war. The army had been divided at 1947 between India and Pakistan. It had fought a war in Kashmir for 1 year. Its resources were not there, has been depleted. They had not been recovered. So where was the potential? Where was the capacity to fight China? China was ready for a fight. If they have marshaled 300,000 soldiers, what was the alternative?
Thank you. And that leads indirectly to another point, which is that surely at the time of the negotiations on the Tibet Agreement of 1954, we knew that we could not possibly hold on to the extraterritorial rights that the British had enjoyed, the offices that British India had in Tibet, the small force, etc. Why could not the giving up of those ab initio not have been used as a bargaining chip to reach some kind of an understanding on the border? I mean, that option was never exercised. And Tanvi and Anant know this very well. I think most in the audience know this. In the instructions that were given to the delegation, the 11-page instruction note, we actually said that we will not only not raise the border question, but if the border question is raised, we will walk out of the negotiations. I mean, this is really, in hindsight, mind-boggling. There is a second question which comes from Mr. Rohan Chaudhary, who said that there was a suggestion from the nationalist Chinese ambassador in Turkey to the Indian ambassador there for India to mediate between Chiang Kai-shek and Mao, which was rejected by the government of India. What is the nature of the debate? I wonder if this is anywhere in the documents that Bhasin Saab has tackled. But seriously, was India remotely in a position to mediate between two major adversaries which had fought literally an existential struggle? Bhasin Saab, what is your response to this question?
Sir, this is Mrs. Chiang Kai-shek had, of course, sent a letter asking him to intervene, and our ambassador in Turkey, of all the places, was also approached Chaman Lal that please tell the Prime Minister if he could intervene. But Prime Minister said, no, I cannot intervene because I'm already been looked upon as a different person, so I cannot, it's not the right time for me to intervene. So that is it.
And also because the die was already cast. I mean, the KMT was on the edge of extinction from the mainland of China. So what was there to negotiate between the two sides? I'm sorry, but that is not a tenable issue. There is a question that comes from one gentleman who says he wants to read out a question. No, sir, please post your question on the chat box. We decided on a procedure. It applies to you as it applies to everybody else. I know people don't like this, but sometimes we have to swallow things and accept that chat box is a convenient way to raise questions. Please. I have a question relating to the Chonlai Jawaharlal Nehru talks of 1960. Bhasin Saab has not referred to one particular document that is also quite interesting in relation to those negotiations. And I refer to a long chapter by Jagat S. Mehta in his book, Negotiating for India. That chapter needs to be read closely with the material that has emerged in the last 3 or 4 years. That is the full records of the 7 rounds of discussions between Zhou Enlai and Jawaharlal Nehru, and Bhasin Saab's book. I think there will be scholars who will be linking these kind of reports, these kind of documents, and looking at them a little more closely than has happened so far. Because Jagat Mehta was one of the few of the actual participants, or shall we say on the periphery of the negotiations, because you remember the Chinese premier and the Indian Prime Minister met entirely by themselves. Nobody was present except for the interpreters, Vasant Paranjpai on the Indian side and the Chinese interpreter. And Vasant Paranjpai's notes are exhaustive. Vasant Paranjpai was trained in China as a Chinese language interpreter. And Chinese language interpreters, like those of the old Soviet school, automatically learn shorthand while they train. This is interesting because this is not done elsewhere. Probably not, but I may be wrong. The net result is that the records that they produce are almost word perfect. And we have one document in the Bhasin collection, the 5-volume collection, where we have the full text of the Indian record of discussion and the full text of the Chinese record of discussion. And that is Jawaharlal Nehru's visit to China in 1955 and his talks with Mao Zedong. Now, how did we get the full text of the Chinese record? That's another story. I'm not going to get into that, but it has been provided by a very enterprising, influential personality who managed to get hold of this. And Tanvi, you will understand perhaps as a person who deals with these kind of documents, getting 2 parallel documents of the same conversation is like gold. It's even more valuable than gold because you can really see the nuances of language and you see the commonalities. There is one crucial difference in that document. I won't tell you what it is. You look for it for yourself, and when you will find it, you will perhaps say that's a small aha moment, but I won't tell you more about it. Do take a look at this. I don't know if Anand has made that comparison between the Indian version of the Jawaharlal Nehru Mao Zedong talks and the Chinese version of the same talks. Quite interesting. Okay, question. There is a question from Mr. K.K. Venkatraman. Yes, Shruti, can you please help me?
Yes. So we have a question from Colonel Venkat, and we also have a question for okay, this one is not directed to anyone.
Let's go to the first question, Shruti. Take
okay,
the first question, please.
So it says that I agree that transparency is essential. Isn't it also a fact that transparency at the later stages, from 1959 to 62, is responsible for the nationalistic opinion which literally forced India into the war? How can we avoid this now?
I think this question is first directed to Anand.
Yes.
But I'm sure Bhasin Saab would also like to comment on it. So Anand first and then Bhasin Saab. And Tanvi, please come in whenever you wish.
Sure. Yeah, I'll be very brief, and I'd like to hear Mr. Bhasin as well on this. No, I agree. It's a double-edged sword, but as I think Tanvi mentioned in her remarks, I think there's no other alternative for a democracy. I don't think hiding facts is the best way of dealing with something, including the boundary. I think even if you look at, if I look at the last part of your question is how can we avoid this now? I don't think there's all that much transparency in how we still deal with events on the boundary. If you look at the events of the last 12 months, a lot of what came out, I think, in the public domain was because journalists were able to get it out, even though I think in the first few months of the LAC crisis of 2020, there was generally a sense of the government of India wanting to try and play it down, perhaps because it was worried about sentiment and worried about reducing its wiggle room in dealing with this, which is understandable. But at the end of the day, I think it did show us, the crisis of last year did show us the risks of doing that. So from my own personal point of view, I would say this as someone who's in the media. I don't think whatever public reaction or sentiment can be justified as a good reason to keep things under wraps. I think even recent events have shown us that doesn't really work very well as a policy.
Bhasin sir?
If from the very beginning, very ordinary things like China's notes and all that had been shared with the public, at the end of the day, public would not have had the feeling of being deceived. See, at the end, what impression was given to the public by our own administration, Prime Minister, everybody, that China has been very deceptive, China has perfidious, China has deceived India. If from the beginning facts were available, basic facts were available, and not put under wrap, things would have been much, much better. For instance, see, when the Chinese media called Nehru resolution the UN, mother of all evils, a parent of all evils, he was very upset. But he asked the ambassador, are they going to give it publicity? And he said, no. He said, okay, I'm also keeping under wrap. Otherwise, it will be very difficult. And at the end, what he said, I don't want to lose Chinese friendship. Where was the friendship he was afraid to lose? There was no friendship. From the beginning, there was no friendship, right? From Tibet, 1950, when the Tibet was occupied, Chinese showed no concern that it is our internal matter and you will not interfere. So there was no friendship at all. And the impression given was India, Chini, bye-bye. There was no friendship, and how we become bhai, I don't know.
Can I jump in here? I think, the thing about calibrating, I think what Mr. Bhasin is pointing out is the need for calibration, which is everybody suddenly finds out in 1959 that this problem exists, whereas it existed from the beginning. Now, you do see a debate on this over the question of two things early on in 49-50. One, on the question of recognition of the People's Republic. But that even Sardar Patel says we have to recognize communist China. It's the reality that exists. But the second was the Chinese takeover of Tibet. But after that, you don't see this discussion in public. Now, you do see in the documents, and I think you'll see this more in the kind of 5-volume collection, as well as other papers and Teen Murthy's, you do see a discussion among Indian policymakers about how public to go. And one of the reasons they didn't want to take this public is because they say, well, if we take it public, there'll be pressure for us to do something, not settle the boundary, to actually do something militarily, and we either don't want to do that or can't do that. I think this does, though, bring up the question of, because you see enough documents, as Mr. Bhasin's book reflects, and as Anand pointed out, of a Nehru that actually does see China as a challenge. The question comes, is then why are you going the other way and saying where you're talking about emotional rhetoric? The equivalent of the swing in Ahmedabad is the Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai, which then turns, because people get so upset, I remember finding a newspaper article where when Zhou Enlai went in 1960, that had turned into slogans of Zhou Enlai Hai Hai. Now, so, this, instead of just saying this is in a relationship that we have to deal in a pragmatic manner, when the emotion comes in, or at least you want to believe it's a friend, I think that creates a problem. It does also raise a question again, which is relevant in more recent times, which is this question of 1954, Ambassador Rana, as you mentioned, this question of leverage. And I think that is a crucial point. To me, that's the crucial question. Why not use the leverage? This is something that is being asked now about the 1971 agreement that Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon made. Fine, have the rapprochement, but get stuff in return. Now, it's another debate, would you have been able to get it? But there was not even an attempt. And if you think, because I think this is Nehru's mistake partly, he saw agreements believed in international law as binding. He expected the Chinese that they agreed on autonomy, it agreed on Indian rights. Whereas what you see over and over again to this day, the Chinese see agreements as instrumental. And they will pick and choose which ones they adhere to and which ones they don't. And so there is a disconnect. And if there is a disconnect, what you need to do is make sure, if you see it's a challenge and agreements will not necessarily hold, then you have to do the military preparation to both deter China so that they are not actually taking those moves. But if they do, then you need to react. And so I think this is a much more complex decision starting from public opinion, but involving a lot of broader questions. And it is about calibration and trade-offs.
So let me raise a basic question.
If I may add,
One second, sir. If you permit
if I may add, it is not just calibration. It is also the issue of your public position and your internal confabulations. Now, you may speak of friendship in public positions, but in your internal confabulations, what are the calculations you apply in terms of national interest? The calculus of national interest was altogether missing from the discussion over a long period of time. This also connects with Y.D. Gandevia's book, Outside the Archives. And Gandevia has described in painful detail the manner in which the daily meeting took place with Panditji, with the three secretaries and the Secretary General, each clutching their bundle of papers and incoming telegrams. They held one-to-one discussion jointly. They all sat together, but each one talked one-to-one with Panditji and received instructions. But there was no collegial discussion at all. It was simply, you received instructions from the Prime Minister. Now, it's leave it to Panditji syndrome, but it's not that simple. It's really, we did not take decisions based on any kind of strategic thinking or calculus. That is really the problem. Bhasin Saab, sorry.
Sir, my basic point is, our borders have never been surveyed, delineated either in east or in the west. China repeatedly requested Nehru, let us sit down and survey and delineate the border scientifically. What was the problem in accepting this? You didn't need any army for that. It was something which was basic. At any time it was basic. And it should have been agreed to, simple. Nothing more was required and there will be no problem at all.
Shruti, would you please come in and with the next question?
Yes, sir. So we have this question from Lakshman, who says, almost all research and discussions have been around our policies and leadership simply because we are a democracy. The plethora of information available on our side makes it convenient to many interpretation. Isn't it an extremely biased way of looking at history? Won't we end up drawing wrong lessons as we are scrutinizing history only from one side of the hill? And this isn't addressed to anyone in particular.
Bhasin Saab, any response from you or from Tanvi?
I have not understood the question, I'm sorry.
The question is that we are only looking at information from one side. We only have, because your documents only show Indian information. If I understand correctly from what Mr. Lakshman has said, we don't know the picture from the other side. Well, I'm afraid that is in the nature of things because Chinese documents, for the great part, are not accessible. Tanvi, Anant, any comment on that?
I mean, I will say, and this goes to something Mr. Bhasin makes a plea for and makes the case for in terms of declassifying. It is worth keeping in mind that China actually did release its papers on 62 at one point, in fact, before India ever did. And so researchers actually got access to their perspective. They've now since closed those archives, but they did release the papers. So there is, I mean, as historians, and Mr. Bhasin does this too, he is taking a vantage point. You can't do everything in one book. So he is looking at one vantage point. But there is literature out there. As historians, we're trained, you don't take one perspective. You do triangulate. You take different vantage points and you build a story. And sometimes you reflect different perceptions. So for example, a lot of the memoirs written after 62, you have to keep in mind whether they were diplomats, intelligence officials, military. You're writing from a perspective of just absolute shock and horror and disappointment and anger at what happened. So you can't just take those. When documents come, then you add American documents, Chinese documents, Indians, British, and then you build a story talking about the gap. So I absolutely agree. You shouldn't look at one perspective, but it's important if somebody is doing a deep dive on one perspective. And this is what Mr. Bhasin's book is quite comprehensive in terms of talking about the various aspects of kind of the Indian view on this.
Okay. Anand, any quick comment on that?
Nothing to add.
Okay, great. Shall we go to the next question, Shruti?
Yes. So the next question is to Dr. Madan. How would you assess the role of the rise of strongly nationalist and centralized leadership in both India and China as having been a factor in the current state of bilateral relations? And how would you compare this period to the Nehru-Mao equation?
I think there is also a question from K.K. Venkatraman that you have perhaps overlooked.
Sir, that was the question that we took first for Mr. Anant Krishnan.
Okay. All right.
We have another question from Rabindra that we can either take right now or after.
Why don't you bring it up, because we are now short of time.
So this is again for Mr. Krishnan. Rabindra says, when China could resolve all their border issues with many of their neighboring countries, including Russia, what stops them from doing so with India? Who is to be blamed for this, China alone or India too?
Okay. Bhasin Saab, any quick comment, please? And then the other two speakers.
Sir, I am sorry, I am not able to understand her question. If you kindly make a brief summary, I will.
Anand, would you like to come in and give a quick summary or response?
Sure, I'll give a summary and response. I think the question was basically, to put it in a nutshell, who shares the blame, given that China has settled its boundaries with land boundaries with 12 out of 14 of its neighbors. The question is, what stops them from doing so with India? Who is to be blamed? The brief answer that I will give is, it's not a convenient answer, but I think both share the blame. And I think that's just how things have been. If you look at even 1960, the fact that a year before that you had, of course, the Longju incident, you had violence on the borders. It's not as if that it's not as if those negotiations took place in a vacuum. And I'd say both do share the blame over the years. I think there's no escaping that fact.
Bhasin Saab, any response?
I will make my comment on the previous question more absolutely, that we have only our sources and not other sources. Our own sources, my book, as in book, is based on our own sources. If our own sources put us in the wrong, does anybody think that Chinese sources will put us in the right? They will further blame us, if at all.
Okay. I think we are in effect out of time. Last 2 minutes of responses, starting with Anand, then Tanvi, then Bhasin Saab. Please, just 2 minutes. Any wrap-up comment you want to give?
Thanks, Ambassador Rana. Just a brief wrap-up comment would be, thank you for having me for this event. Thank you to Mr. Bhasin for writing this book and for the stellar work you've really done, even with your previous 5 volumes. It's a huge service to all of us who are following this. And I do urge all of you to read the book. And I personally do endorse your call for more access to information and a bigger public debate. I know many former diplomats don't agree with this, but the idea that I believe as well, that I think at some point we do need to have a more rational, informed debate on the boundary. And I think moving relations as well to a sense where it's less emotive and more driven by our own self-interest and our own view of the relationship. I think, for instance, even with the boundary, the case for having a settled border, a peaceful border, is because it's in our interest, not because of having rosy-eyed views of China or relations with China. And I think the book is an extremely important addition and an intervention in the current debate that we're having right now of where do relations with China go. I think all of us agree that after 2020, it's at a very interesting crossroads. We don't quite know where it's going. The consensus seems to be this pattern that we've had since 1988 of ignoring the boundary and ignoring differences is untenable. So I think it's an extremely timely intervention in this debate, and I thank you for writing this book.
Tanvi, thank you very much, Anand. Tanvi?
Thank you, Master Anna. I will very quickly say there are many differences between the Mount Nehru period and now, including the major capabilities gap between India and China, which does shape kind of China's willingness to do things like demarcate the border right now, or even talk about some of the issues India wants to talk about. But I will say, and kind of echoing Anand, this is really a book worth reading. And part of that is that even when we're reading them as readers, the idea of books like this, and you'll see governments more willing to declassify papers, but when they think that you're going to have kind of academic treatments of this, scholarly treatments, where you learn from it, and it's not about blame games, but to how to ensure we don't make the same mistakes again. It is not because people were badly intentioned, because Nehru didn't think about national interest, because people are evil. It is because they're human beings and they make mistakes. So what are those mistakes? What are the systemic ones? What are the individual ones? And if you approach it like that, you actually start to see their constraints as well, and it will make for a better understanding of what policymakers have to grapple with. And I think this book shows that in kind of a comprehensive way, that you can look at these issues and assess kind of where things went wrong, without having to get polemical about it. And so I would suggest for various reasons that this should be on everybody's must-read list, and a very valuable contribution to the debate on China-India relations.
Thank you very much. Bhasin Saab?
After Mr. Anand and Tanvi has spoken, there's hardly any scope left for me to say anything. I have only to thank everybody, both the speakers and you also, sir, for chairing it, and the Institute of Chinese Studies for giving all of us this opportunity to discuss the book. Thank you very much as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you. Let me use the chair's privilege to make a couple of points. First, what we see from a book like this really is, as Tanvi said, it shows how decisions are taken, how issues are handled, and the forces that are at play, the thinking of the principal actors. Now, as Bhasin Saab will be probably the first to agree, the documents to which he has had access are in most cases the finished products or certain major pieces. What we don't have is access to the process that led to those actions, those papers, those statements, those documents, because we don't have those files. And you know the story. The treasure trove that Bhasin Saab found at the Nehru Library were the personal papers of one of the major actors of that period. But he did not have the files. He simply had some of the major papers and surely not all the papers. So this reinforces the point that there is a need for more material to come out. At this distance in time, finger pointing gets us nowhere. We need documents in order to understand how we handled issues in the past, and if we can learn from that in relation to the issues we face today. There is really no embarrassment involved in old papers and in release of papers. I would respectfully submit to anybody who's in authority and can decide on this. There is another point, that if by chance we had somehow managed to achieve a settled border in 1960 or whenever, would that have avoided the kind of problems that exist today in the India-China relationship? Assuming that everything else was equal, assuming that the global events and the economic and political and social development of the two countries, India and China, and the region, had proceeded in the same lines as today. I want to make the point that today the border is probably the idiom through which pressure is exerted by a China that wants to, in a sense, put India on the back foot. A China that would like India to divert resources from economic development to military expenditure. And remember, this is always the struggle in every country. What is the right balance between bread and arms, butter and arms? Jawaharlal Nehru faced this in 1950. Jawaharlal Nehru was not at all a foolish man. He took certain risks. He made certain calculations, perhaps miscalculations, premised on the fact that India had to build up the sinews of its power. And remember, in the Bhasin collection, there is a fine piece, I think it goes back to 1950 or 51, in which Panditji says that the real power of a country is its political power and economic power. Power is not in terms of the troops you can send to the frontier. Power is not the number of Rafale aircraft for which you can write a check to purchase these aircraft. And at the end of the day, the India-China story, I would respectfully submit, and the global story as far as India is concerned, will be played out through India's political and economic capacity. Not the number of warships that we can buy, but the capacity of India to engage the world. And this is why I'm one of those who believes that we have made a mistake in walking out of RCEP. We have to engage with the world. Of course, industry will always cry for protection. Industries always cry for protection. That is their normal state of existence. But the task of economic governance lies in taking hard decisions on a long-term calculus of national interests and not today's calculus of pleasing a certain lobby. Thank you very much. Anand, Tanvi, you've been gracious in joining us at this discussion. And of course, Bhasin Saab, my old friend for 50 years. I used to think that I kind of half-headed a division where he was a desk officer. But Bhasin Saab was really my teacher. He was my guru. He guided me and saved me from any number of stupid mistakes which I would have made if I had not had a person of the wisdom and the big heart that is the hallmark of this man who has been really a friend of mine for more than 50 years now. I want to thank the Institute of Chinese Studies, my good friend Ashok Kant, Shruti, and everybody else on the team who have made this event possible. And please forgive me if we have not come around to taking up some of the questions that came in the chat window, but we are completely out of time. Thank you very much again, all of you, and my deepest thanks to the audience who have stayed on